Hello everyone and welcome to Anyone Can Click, where we break down photography to its absolute basics 1 week at a time. In the last video, we saw how we can use aperture to control the amount of light and to get the depth of field in our photographs. Now once this light has entered the lens, it continues on its path until it meets checkpoint number 2. This is shutter speed, and today we will learn everything that we need to know about shutter speed at this stage. Once again, we will solve 5 examples which will give you the confidence about the topic. A super helpful on-field reference guide of today's session is linked in the description box below. Click to get your copy. However, I do recommend you watch the video till the end for the guide to make sense. So, let's begin. Before I tell you what shutter speed actually is, I'm going to tell you what it is not. Shutter speed is not a measure of speed at all. It is a measure of time. It is the length of time for which the shutter curtains remain open so as to let the light inside. So naturally, longer the duration, more is the light that's going to enter in, and shorter the duration, lesser is the light that's going to enter. This is how shutter speed can be used to manage exposure. Because it is a measure of time, it is represented in seconds. So a shutter speed can be 1 second and it can go all the way up to 30 seconds, and there are ways to prolong it even further than that. On the other hand, it can also be a fraction of a second. It can be half a second, it can be 1/10 of a second, 1/100th of a second, and typically in a lot of cameras, it can go all the way to 1/4000th of a second. And in some cases, it can even be as fast as 1/8000 or 1/16,000th of a second. Now that we have a broad idea of the scale, let's understand how shutter speed impacts exposure. Now before we proceed with the example, I'm going to take a tiny detour and share a small observation with you. Many times in the beginning phase of photography, a lot of confusion can be avoided if we use the right terms to communicate, not only to each other, but even within our minds. One such case is with shutter speed. When speaking about shutter speed, using words like increasing or decreasing can be counterintuitive and the cause for some confusion. Therefore, it's better to stick to words like faster or slower, or longer or shorter when we speak about shutter speed. The reason is you can physically listen and differentiate between a fast shutter and a slow shutter. Now, this here is a fast shutter, but on the other hand, this is what a slow shutter sounds like. There you go. So naturally, if the shutter is slow, it's open for a longer time, more light gets in. So it becomes easy to rehash that on the field. Anyway, now that we have gotten that out of the way, let's return back to our example. Like we did in aperture, I'm going to keep all my settings constant and I'm only going to be changing the shutter speed. So whatever change in exposure we see is because of shutter speed. This image was taken at 1/60th of a second. As the shutter speed becomes faster and faster, the duration of time for which the window is open is much smaller, which is why less and less light is entering the camera and our images are getting progressively darker. Now let's move in the other direction. I'm going to now make the shutter speed slower, which means more light is going to be allowed into the camera, which is why the exposure of the photograph continues to increase. Now I want you to notice that the magnitude of impact of a slow shutter on exposure is so dramatic that after a point, it is just all light, no photo. This is the power of shutter speed. That is how much light it is capable of letting into our camera. And like Uncle Ben says, with great power comes great responsibility, which is why one of the main reasons for blurry and shaky photographs is shutter speed. The best way to demonstrate that is with the help of this example. So I've pasted a beautiful photograph on this fan and I have switched it on. Now I'm going to take photos at different shutter speeds, and I would like you to observe the qualitative effect that different shutter speeds have on this photograph. All we can appreciate here is a swirl of colors. But as the shutter speed becomes faster, you begin to notice details emerge out of that frame until we reach a point where the frame is effectively frozen. From this example, we can see that one of the main factors that determine the sharpness of a photograph is shutter speed. But the story is not over yet. What I will do next is I'm going to switch off the fan and take one more photograph, once again at 1/20th of a second. Now this time I have managed to get a really sharp photograph. How did that happen? The shutter speed in both of these photos is the same, and yet the effect is completely different. In order to freeze a frame, in order to get sharp photographs, it is very important to get the right shutter speed in relation to the speed of the subject. So if I have set my shutter speed at, let's say, 8 seconds, and in those 8 seconds, I have, let's say, picked up the pen, kept it here, picked up a coffee mug, had coffee, all of that is going to be blended into one photograph and presented to you, which is why it ends up looking so blurry. In contrast, if you've set a very fast shutter speed, 1/4000th of a second, can you imagine what that must be like? So whatever the camera sees, in that fraction of a second, it's going to only present that to you. This is how it is able to freeze the motion, which is why the shutter speed required to freeze the motion of a sprinting cheetah is going to be very, very different from the shutter speed required to photograph a pride of blazing lions. And truly, all it takes to determine this shutter speed is a little bit of practice. There is a general guideline that is very helpful in the beginning phase of photography. This is what it looks like. Can you believe me if I tell you that the story is still not over? Because sometimes the culprit is not in front of the camera, it is behind the camera. And as much as we all would love to believe that we have that absolutely steady hand, a little bit of camera shake during the process of clicking is inevitable. Now at high shutter speeds, this does not really affect the photograph, but as the shutter speed becomes slower and slower, the impact of this camera shake on the photograph starts to become more pronounced. To avoid this, there is something known as the focal length rule. The focal length rule in photography is a guideline used to determine the appropriate shutter speed for capturing sharp images, especially when shooting handheld. It states that to minimize motion blur caused by camera shake, the minimum shutter speed should be approximately equal to the reciprocal of the focal length of the lens. What this tells us is that when we are photographing, we should try to keep our minimum shutter speed, which is our safe shutter speed, at 1 by focal length, which means that if I'm photographing with, let's say, this 300mm lens, my minimum shutter speed should be 1/300. But then again, this is just a guideline. If you indeed have steady hands, you can go as low as 1/60th handheld to get those sharp photographs. Now that we have a broad understanding of shutter speed, let's solve these 5 examples, at the end of which I'm sure you will feel a little more comfortable with this entire topic. Now, things to keep in mind before we solve these questions. Point number 1, fast shutter speeds freeze motion. Remember, 1/1000 is faster than 1/500. Point number 2, to get sharp photographs, set the shutter speed relative to the speed of the subject. Faster the subject, faster the shutter speed required to freeze its motion. In these examples, we are assuming optimum lighting conditions. But in reality, availability of light plays an important role in determining the shutter speed. But we'll get to that in a separate episode. This here is just a footnote. Now, question number 1. Match the subject to the correct shutter speed required to get a sharp photograph. Now, as we discussed, in order to get a sharp photograph, we need to set the shutter speed relative to the speed of the subject. Now, faster the subject, faster must be the shutter speed required in order to freeze the movement. Now, a hunting cheetah is extremely fast, which is why it requires a shutter speed of almost 1/4000 to get a sharp image. A walking cheetah, on the other hand, is relatively slower and hence a shutter speed of 1/500 will do the job. Now, a sleeping cheetah will have barely any movement and hence it can be photographed sharply even at a shutter speed of 1/250. Question number 2. What shutter speed range would you use to ensure that the players are captured sharply without motion blur in the following games? Again, like we did in the previous question, we have to determine the speed of movement of the subjects in various sports. Faster the speed of the subject, faster is the shutter speed required to freeze their motion. Now in F1, which is why the correct answer is as follows. Question number 3. What do you think would be the shutter speed for this photo? Now, as you can see, the water in the waterfalls looks smooth and creamy, almost continuous. Now, this is a result of motion blur. And in order to get motion blur in photograph, the shutter speed needs to be slow. And hence, for this photograph, the shutter speed in all likelihood was. Question number 4. Between 1/4000 and 1/2000, in which case is less light entering the camera? Now, this is a fairly elementary question, but still it can lead to some confusion. Now, 1/4000 is a faster shutter speed compared to 1/2000. Faster the shutter speed, lesser is the time for which the shutter curtains are open, which means less light enters the camera, and hence the answer for this question is 1/4000. Question number 5. You're photographing with a 500 mm lens. What would be a safe shutter speed to photograph the following in order to get sharp images? This is very similar to question number 1, and yet it is a trick question. Since we are shooting with a handheld device, we cannot forget the reciprocal focal length rule. The safest speed in this case would be 1/500 because we are photographing with a 500 mm lens, regardless of the situation. And hence, it is still not advisable to use a shutter speed of 1/250 because here we may risk introducing camera shake, which again can hamper the sharpness of the photograph. So, if the lighting conditions are good, a shutter speed of 1/500 would be ideal. With that, we have reached the end of this topic on shutter speed. But for this video, I have saved the best for the last. I would like to share some stunning photographs with you. Please note that I haven't clicked these photographs, but there's a reason I'm sharing them with you. Now, all of these photographs have one thing in common, and that is a slow shutter speed. Now, I know that we've discussed that slow shutter speeds can break a photograph, but when used correctly, when used intentionally, they can break boundaries and create such fantastic looking frames. This is truly one of those settings that has, in my view, the maximum potential to create standout creative frames. And while I spent enough time practicing macro photography, camera trapping and other genres of wildlife photography, I haven't truly invested and dedicated enough time to perfecting the art of slow shutter photography. But that does not change the fact that I find these images truly inspirational, and I wanted you to see the potential of slow shutter photography for what it really is. And if and when I do decide to pick this art, these are the images which are going to be my goalposts. On that note, I have reached the end of this video. If you found this video of value, please do like, subscribe, comment. I would love to listen to your thoughts. And yes, it would definitely help the channel. In the next week, we are going to cover the third and final tool of the exposure triangle, and that is ISO. Once we've done that, we can put all of these three tools together and learn about the exposure triangle and how to use that to get the correct exposure. Until then, take care. Goodbye.